They called themselves the Hegemony, and for 3,000 years, their name had been whispered in terror across a million worlds. Entire civilizations knelt before their crimson banners, knowing that resistance meant extinction. The proud Zalori had tried to fight. Their crystal cities now lay in radioactive ruin. The peaceful Morellans had attempted diplomacy. Their negotiators' heads still decorated hegemony command ships as trophies. The technologically advanced Kythera had thought their shields impenetrable. Their home system was now a graveyard of shattered planets. But there was one species the hegemony had never encountered. One small blue world tucked away in an unremarkable spiral arm that they had simply overlooked. The inhabitants called themselves humans, and they had been watching, learning, preparing. The hegemony was about to discover that in their 3 millennia of conquest, they had made one fatal mistake. They had never faced a species that viewed cruelty not as strength, but as an unforgivable sin. They were about to learn that some lines, once crossed, awakened something far more dangerous than fear. They were about to meet humanity's wrath. Captain Vexhai of the Hegemony dreadnought Crimson Fang stood before the tactical display, his 4 eyes gleaming with anticipation. The holographic projection showed a small blue-green planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Intelligence reports indicated a primitive species. They hadn't even achieved faster-than-light travel. Perfect for what the hegemony had planned. "Begin the demonstration protocol," Vexhai commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had personally overseen the subjugation of 14 worlds. The bridge crew, a mixture of conquered species now serving their masters, moved with practiced efficiency. They had done this countless times before. The first wave of hegemony ships descended through Earth's atmosphere like falling meteors. Their arrival was not announced through diplomatic channels or formal contact procedures. The hegemony had learned long ago that fear was more effective than conversation. Their vessels, each one the size of a city block, positioned themselves over major population centers. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, 12 cities in total. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the Strategic Command Center, buried deep beneath the Colorado Mountains, watching the feeds from around the globe. At 62, she had seen humanity's worst conflicts, but nothing had prepared her for this. The alien ships hung in the sky like ominous storm clouds, their dark hulls absorbing sunlight and casting shadows over millions of people below. "Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission," reported Lieutenant Morrison, his hands trembling slightly as he worked his console. It's in English. Somehow they know our language." The main screen flickered, and the image of Captain Vexhai appeared. His species was tall, roughly humanoid, but with 4 arms and skin that shifted between grey and deep purple depending on the light. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent that suggested he had studied human speech patterns extensively. "Primitive inhabitants of the 3rd planet. I am Captain Vexhai of the Hegemony 4th Fleet. You now exist under our dominion. You will surrender all military assets, disband your governments, and prepare your population for integration into our empire. You have 1 rotation of your planet to comply." Admiral Chen stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of United Earth Defense. By what authority do you make these demands? We are a sovereign world, and we will not." Vexhai's laugh was a harsh, grating sound. "Authority? Child, look to your skies. We have conquered the Zalari Confederation, whose warriors were legends across 3 galactic arms. We have enslaved the brilliant Miralans, whose technology was beyond your comprehension. We have broken the Kythera, who commanded fleets that could move stars. What makes you think your small, backwards world deserves special consideration?" "Because," Chen said quietly, "we're human." There was a pause. Vexhai's 4 eyes narrowed. "Explain." "We're the species that looked at an ocean and decided to cross it. We're the ones who saw mountains and climbed them just to see what was on the other side. We're the species that split the atom, walked on our moon, and sent probes to the edge of our solar system. And most importantly," her voice hardened, "we're the species that doesn't kneel." Vexhai's expression shifted to something resembling amusement. "Your defiance is quaint. Perhaps a demonstration is in order." He gestured with one of his 4 arms, and the transmission cut. Within minutes, reports flooded in from around the globe. The hegemony ships had deployed smaller craft, not to land, but to harvest. Dr. James Okafor, a xenobiology professor at Oxford who had been in London when the ships arrived, found himself watching in horror from his apartment window as sleek alien shuttles descended into crowded areas. What emerged were not soldiers, but collectors. The hegemony had perfected the art of terror over 3 millennia. They didn't simply kill. That was wasteful. Instead, they took samples. 100 people from each city, selected seemingly at random. Families were separated, individuals plucked from crowds, all while the vast ships overhead remained untouchable by any weapon humanity possessed. But the hegemony had misunderstood something fundamental about their new targets. When they had conquered the Zalari, they had faced a warrior culture that valued honor above all else. When faced with impossible odds, Zalari warriors accepted noble death. When they had broken the Mirrorlands, they had confronted a species that prized logic and efficiency. The Mirrorlands had calculated their chances and surrendered to preserve their civilization. Humans were different. As news of the abduction spread across the planet, something unprecedented happened. Instead of cowering in fear or calculating odds of survival, humanity got angry. Not the quick, hot anger that burned out fast, but the cold, calculating fury that planned and endured. In the depths of the Pacific Ocean, Captain Rebecca Torres of the submarine USS Montana received her orders through encrypted channels. Her vessel was one of 12 nuclear submarines positioned strategically around the globe, each loaded with experimental weapons that had been developed in secret over the past 50 years. The official story was that humanity had given up space-based weapons development after the treaties of 2157. The unofficial truth was that humanity had never stopped preparing for the worst-case scenario. "Con, sonar," came the report from her chief petty officer. "I'm reading massive displacement overhead. These things are even bigger than the satellite imagery suggested." Torres studied the tactical display. The hegemony ships were enormous, but they had one critical weakness. They were designed for intimidation, not defense. After conquering countless worlds with minimal resistance, their captains had grown complacent. Their shields were powerful against conventional weapons, but the devices they faced were anything but conventional. Meanwhile, on the surface, the world was watching. Every television network, every streaming service, every social media platform was broadcasting the same images. Alien ships hanging in the sky like malevolent gods, and the empty spaces where human beings had been taken. But instead of panic, something else was building. In Tokyo, engineer Kenji Nakamura was in his laboratory when the first ship appeared. As the alien collectors descended into the streets below, he didn't run or hide. Instead, he began uploading every piece of research data he had been working on to secure servers around the globe. If humanity was going to fight, they would need every advantage they could get. In Mumbai, Dr. Huwale, Priya Sharma was treating patients in her hospital when the chaos began. As alien shuttles swept through the city, she made a decision that would echo across the planet. She activated the emergency medical protocols that would preserve every piece of knowledge, every breakthrough, every innovation that humanity had achieved in medicine and biotechnology. If some humans were to be taken, the rest would be stronger for their sacrifice. The pattern repeated across the globe. In Sao Paulo, geneticist Carlos Rodriguez transmitted his life's work on human adaptation and survival. In Berlin, physicist Anna Müller uploaded her research on quantum mechanics and particle physics. In Cairo, archaeologist Dr. Igwad Ahmed Hassan sent every piece of data about human history and culture to hidden archives. Humanity wasn't just being defiant, they were becoming something more dangerous than the hegemony had ever encountered. They were becoming unified. Captain Vexhai observed the human response with growing puzzlement. When the Zalari had faced collection, their warriors had fought bravely but futilely, dying with honor while their people wept. When the Mirrorlands had been harvested, they had attempted to negotiate, offering technological tributes in exchange for reduced quotas. The Kythera had simply withdrawn into their cities and waited for the storm to pass. But these humans were doing something different. They weren't fighting the collection directly, nor were they attempting to negotiate. Instead, they seemed to be preparing. Vexhai's intelligence officers reported massive data transfers across the planet, the mobilization of military assets that had been previously unknown, and most disturbing of all, a complete absence of panic or despair among the population. "Captain," his tactical officer reported, "we're detecting unusual energy signatures from multiple locations. The humans appear to be activating some form of defensive grid." Vexhai's forearms flexed with irritation. "Defensive grid? Our scans showed no orbital defenses, no significant military space capabilities. What could they possibly—" The first explosion lit up the night sky over the Atlantic Ocean. A hegemony transport ship, carrying its harvest of human specimens, simply vanished in a brilliant flash of light. Debris rained down into the ocean as secondary explosions rippled through the darkness. "Report." Vexhai snarled. "Unknown weapons fire, Captain. The source appears to be underwater?" Our sensors show multiple launches from beneath the ocean's surface. On the USS Montana, Captain Torres was already reloading. The experimental plasma torpedoes had worked exactly as designed, punching through hegemony shields like they were made of paper. Around the globe, her counterparts were doing the same. 12 submarines, 12 different ocean basins, 12 different firing positions. But the underwater assault was only the beginning. High above the Earth's atmosphere, satellites that had been launched over the past 50 years and disguised as communications relays suddenly revealed their true purpose. They weren't broadcasting television signals or internet data. They were weapons platforms, each one equipped with kinetic bombardment systems that had been developed in absolute secrecy. The hegemony ships hanging over Earth's cities found themselves caught in a crossfire they had never imagined possible. From below, plasma torpedoes punched through their hulls with impossible accuracy. From above, tungsten rods accelerated to near-light speed by magnetic launchers turned their armor into superheated plasma. And from all around, something even more dangerous was emerging. Humanity was no longer scattered and afraid. For the first time in their species' history, every human being on the planet was united by a single purpose: the complete and utter destruction of those who had dared to harm their own. In the Strategic Command Center, Admiral Chen watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. The first phase of Earth's defense was proceeding exactly as planned, but she knew this was only the opening move in what would be a much larger game. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Morrison reported, his voice steady now despite the chaos unfolding around the globe, "we're receiving priority communications from Luna Base, Mars Station, and the Asteroid Mining Consortium. All defense protocols have been activated." Chen nodded. The hegemony thought they were facing a primitive world with no space-based military capabilities. They were about to discover that humanity's real strength had never been on Earth at all. As the first hegemony ships began to burn in Earth's atmosphere, their wreckage adding new aurora to the night sky, Captain Vexhay realized he had made a critical error in judgment. These weren't primitive savages cowering before superior technology. These were apex predators who had been pretending to be sheep. And now the pretense was over. The communication channels crackled to life as reports flooded in from across the hegemony fleet. Ships were under attack not just from the planet's surface, but from vessels emerging from hidden bases on the planet's moon, from installations on the fourth planet of the system, and from what appeared to be mobile platforms scattered throughout the asteroid belt.
"Captain," his communications officer reported, her voice tight with fear. "We're receiving a transmission from the human admiral."
Admiral Chen's face appeared on the main screen, but something had changed in her expression. The diplomatic mask was gone, replaced by something that made Vexay's blood run cold.
When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of not just her own authority, but of an entire species that had just declared war.
"Captain Vexhay."
You wanted to demonstrate your power. You wanted to show us what happens to those who defy the hegemony. You took our people. You threatened our world. You made one mistake. She leaned forward, and Vexay saw something in her eyes that he had never seen in any of the countless species the hegemony had conquered. It wasn't fear, or desperation, or even anger. It was certainty. You assumed we were like everyone else you've faced. You thought we would break like the others, surrender like the others, beg for mercy like the others. But we're not like the others, Captain. We're human. And humans have a very simple rule when it comes to those who harm our own. The transmission cut, and Captain Vexhay found himself staring at a blank screen while explosions lit up the space around his flagship. For the first time in his career as a hegemony captain, he felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a young soldier on his first deployment. He felt afraid. Around Earth, the tide of battle was shifting with devastating speed. The hegemony ships, designed to intimidate rather than fight, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by weapons and tactics they had never encountered. Human ships emerged from concealment throughout the solar system, their hulls bearing no flags or insignia except for a simple message painted in letters large enough to be read by enemy sensors. Remember Earth. As the first day of what would later be known as the Terran War drew to a close, the galaxy was about to learn something that the hegemony, in their 3,000 years of conquest, had never discovered. Some species don't just fight back. Some species fight back with everything they have, everything they've ever built, and everything they're willing to become. Humanity was one of those species. And the war had only just begun. 3 months after first contact, the hegemony was learning that their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. For 3,000 years, they had conquered through intimidation and overwhelming force, never needing to adapt their tactics because no species had ever forced them to evolve. But humans fought differently than anyone they had faced before. Fleet Admiral Kethvar stared at the tactical display aboard the massive dreadnought Galaxy's End, watching red icons disappear from his screens with growing frustration. The human fleet that had emerged from the outer system's asteroid belt was smaller than his forces, their ships were individually weaker, and their technology was demonstrably inferior. By every metric the hegemony used to measure military strength, this should have been a massacre. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare. "Admiral," his chief tactical officer reported, her voice tight with confusion, "the human vessels are employing tactics that don't make sense. They're sacrificing entire squadrons to destroy single ships, using their own vessels as guided weapons, and coordinating attacks through methods our interceptors can't decode." Kethvar's primary eyes focused on the display while his secondary eyes tracked the damage reports scrolling across auxiliary screens. The humans were fighting with a desperation and creativity that defied all hegemony tactical doctrine. When faced with superior shielding, they rammed their ships into enemy hulls at maximum velocity. When outgunned, they used their own reactors as improvised weapons, creating fusion explosions that took out entire formations. When cornered, they fought to the last ship, the last shot, the last breath. But it was more than just desperation driving them. It was something the hegemony had never encountered in 3 millennia of conquest: absolute moral certainty. Captain Elena Vasquez of the Earth Defense Force destroyer Indomitable watched her tactical display as her ship maneuvered through the debris field that had once been the hegemony cruiser Soul Render. Her ship was damaged, her crew was exhausted, and her ammunition was running low. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the data packet she had received 3 hours earlier. The hegemony had broadcast the execution of the human captives. They had done it as a warning, a demonstration of what happened to species that dared to resist. They had forced the captured humans to kneel in the cargo bay of a transport ship, then systematically executed them while broadcasting the images across every frequency they could access. Men, women, children. It hadn't mattered to the hegemony. They were making a point. They had no idea what point they had actually made. "Captain," her communications officer reported, "we're receiving the latest intelligence update from command. The data we've been collecting on hegemony ship construction has been analyzed. Engineering thinks they've found a weakness." Vasquez nodded grimly. For the past 3 months, every human ship that engaged the enemy had been gathering information. Not just tactical data, but engineering specifications, metal compositions, shield frequencies, and power distribution patterns. While the hegemony had been trying to crush human resistance through brute force, humanity had been learning everything they could about their enemies. It was a very human approach to warfare: adapt, overcome, and never make the same mistake twice. The breakthrough had come from an unlikely source. Sarah Kim, a metallurgical engineer who had been working on the Mars terraforming project when the war began, had noticed something in the spectral analysis of hegemony ship hulls. The aliens had been using the same alloy composition for centuries, a metal compound that was incredibly strong, but had one critical weakness. It became brittle at specific frequency resonances. Within hours of Dr. Kim's discovery, every human ship in the fleet was being retrofitted with harmonic resonance weapons. The technology was crude, barely more than modified industrial equipment, but it was effective. Hegemony ships that had withstood direct nuclear strikes were suddenly cracking apart like eggshells when exposed to the right frequency modulations. But the humans had learned something else from their enemy's broadcast execution. They had learned what the hegemony truly was. Commander James Wright stood in the briefing room of the Lunar Defense Station, addressing a gathering of military officers, scientists, and civilian leaders via holographic projection. Behind him, the display showed intelligence gathered from captured hegemony databases. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wright began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal, "we now know why the hegemony broadcasts their executions. It's not just psychological warfare, it's entertainment." The room fell silent. Wright gestured to the display, which showed data extracted from a damaged hegemony ship. The hegemony doesn't just conquer worlds for resources or territory. They do it for sport. The execution of prisoners, the destruction of civilizations, the harvesting of entire populations. These aren't military necessities. They're broadcast across their empire as recreational programming. They have an audience of billions watching our people die for their amusement. The implications of this revelation rippled through the human command structure like a shockwave. This wasn't a war of conquest or ideology. This wasn't even a war for resources. This was genocide as a form of entertainment, conducted by a species that had turned cruelty into an art form. And that changed everything. Within days of the intelligence briefing, human tactics began to evolve in ways that caught the hegemony completely off guard. Human ships stopped trying to minimize casualties and started maximizing them. Every engagement became a trap, every retreat became an ambush, and every victory became a stepping stone to something more devastating. Captain Lisa Park of the stealth frigate Shadow Walker exemplified this new approach. Her ship had been designed for reconnaissance and data gathering, but she had turned it into something far more dangerous, a ghost that haunted hegemony shipping lanes. Using stealth technology originally developed for asteroid mining operations, the Shadow Walker could approach enemy vessels undetected, plant fusion charges on their hulls, and disappear before the explosions could be traced. But Park wasn't just destroying ships, she was sending messages. After each successful attack, she would broadcast a recording to any hegemony vessels in range. The message was always the same: a list of the humans who had been executed, their names, their ages, their families. Then she would add a simple statement that had become the unofficial motto of the human resistance: "We remember. We are coming. We do not forgive." The psychological impact on hegemony forces was immediate and devastating. Species that had conquered the galaxy through intimidation found themselves being intimidated. Soldiers who had never known fear discovered what it meant to be hunted by an enemy that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike without warning, and vanish like smoke. Meanwhile, on Earth, the transformation of human society was accelerating at an unprecedented pace. The attack had unified the species in a way that no political movement or philosophy ever had. National boundaries became irrelevant. Religious differences were set aside. Economic systems were reorganized around a single priority: the complete mobilization of human civilization for war. Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood in the converted automobile factory in Detroit, watching as the production lines that had once built civilian vehicles now manufactured plasma cannons. Around the globe, similar transformations were taking place. Entertainment centers became research facilities. Universities became weapons development labs. Even art museums were converted into strategic planning centers, their curators applying the same attention to detail they had once used for paintings to the logistics of interplanetary warfare. But the most significant change was happening in humanity itself. The hegemony had made a fundamental error in their understanding of human psychology. They had assumed that terror would break human resolve, that the execution of prisoners would convince the species to surrender. Instead, they had triggered something far more dangerous. They had given humanity permission to stop holding back. For centuries, human civilization had been built on the idea of restraint. Laws, treaties, ethical guidelines, all designed to prevent humanity from becoming the monsters they were capable of being. But the hegemony had crossed a line that negated all of those restraints. They had harmed innocence for entertainment, and in doing so, they had freed humanity from its own moral limitations. The results were terrifying in their efficiency. Commander Maria Santos led the first human boarding action against a hegemony vessel, the troop transport Bone Crusher. Her team of 30 Marines had trained for close-quarters combat in zero gravity, but nothing had prepared them for what they found aboard the enemy ship. The hegemony had converted sections of their vessels into torture chambers, spaces where captured humans were kept alive for the entertainment of their crews. Santos and her team moved through the ship with surgical precision, but what they saw in those chambers changed them. By the time they reached the bridge, they were no longer soldiers following rules of engagement. They were humanity's vengeance made manifest. The surviving hegemony crew members would later testify that humans fought with a ferocity that defied explanation. They showed no mercy, took no prisoners, and seemed to feel no fear. But more than that, they appeared to genuinely enjoy the violence they were inflicting. The hegemony, who had built their empire on cruelty, discovered they had never truly understood what cruelty could become. Fleet Admiral HFY received the distress signal from the Bone Crusher just as his flagship was engaging a human battle group near the Jupiter orbital stations. The message was brief but chilling. The transport had been boarded, the crew was dead, and the humans had used the ship's own broadcast equipment to transmit images of the carnage back to hegemony space. That the humans hadn't just killed the crew, they had done something far more sophisticated and psychologically devastating. They had forced the hegemony soldiers to experience the same terror their victims had felt. They had made them beg. They had made them suffer. And they had recorded everything. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, her voice shaking. "We're receiving similar reports from throughout the sector. Human forces aren't just attacking our ships. They're making examples of our crews." HFY studied the tactical display with growing unease. The humans had been learning from every engagement, adapting their tactics and improving their technology at an impossible rate. But now they were doing something else. They were fighting back using the hegemony's own methods, but with a precision and creativity that the aliens had never possessed. The hegemony had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of terror. Humanity was learning to perfect it in 3 months. But the most disturbing development wasn't the human military advances or their tactical innovations. It was the way they were changing as a species. Intelligence reports from occupied territories described human resistance cells that operated with a level of coordination and dedication that bordered on the supernatural. Humans who had never met each other were working together as if they shared a single mind. Communities that had been separated by vast distances were functioning as unified organisms. The hegemony was facing something they had never encountered in their long history of conquest, a species that became more dangerous the more it was threatened. Rebecca Hayes, the xenopsychologist who had been studying hegemony behavior patterns, made the discovery that would reshape human understanding of their enemy. Working from her laboratory in the Antarctic Research Station, she had been analyzing communication intercepts and prisoner interrogations when she noticed a pattern. "They're not just cruel," she explained to the Emergency Science Council via secure transmission. "They're bored. The hegemony has reached a point in their technological and social development where conquest has become routine. They don't expand their empire because they need resources or territory. They do it because they need stimulation." The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't fighting a military force or a political entity. They were fighting a civilization of sadists who had run out of ways to entertain themselves until they discovered that destroying other species provided the thrill they were seeking. But here's the thing. Dr. Hayes continued, her voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before the war began. "We're not boring them anymore. For the first time in millennia, they're fighting an enemy that's actually dangerous, and they don't know how to handle it." As the second phase of the war drew to a close, both sides were transforming in ways that would have been unimaginable just months before. The hegemony was learning what fear felt like, while humanity was learning what it meant to fight without moral constraints. But the most significant change was yet to come. Deep in the outer system, human scientists and engineers were working on projects that would make their previous military innovations seem primitive by comparison. They were building weapons that would force the hegemony to confront a simple truth. They weren't the only species capable of galaxy-spanning cruelty. They were just the first to try it. Admiral Chen stood in the Strategic Command Center, watching the latest battle reports with grim satisfaction. The hegemony was retreating from the inner system, their forces bloodied and demoralized. But she knew this was only a temporary victory. The real war was about to begin. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Morrison reported, "we're receiving confirmation from Project Prometheus. The deep space installations are operational." Chen nodded. Project Prometheus was humanity's answer to 3,000 years of hegemony expansion. It wasn't just a weapon or a fleet or a defensive system. It was something far more ambitious. It was humanity's declaration that they were no longer content to simply defend Earth. They were going to take the war to the enemy. All of them. "Send the signal," Chen ordered. "Begin the third phase." Across human space, from Earth to Mars to the asteroid belt and beyond, the message went out simultaneously. It was broadcast on every frequency, translated into every language, and transmitted to every human settlement in the solar system. "This is Admiral Chen of United Earth Defense. The enemy has shown us what they are. They have demonstrated their cruelty, their arrogance, and their contempt for all other life. They have made one fatal error. They have assumed we would be victims." The transmission paused, and when it resumed, Chen's voice carried the weight of an entire species' determination. "They were wrong. We are not victims. We are not prey. We are humanity, and we are done playing defense. It's time to show the galaxy what happens when you threaten our own." Deep in space beyond the orbit of Pluto, massive structures that had been hidden in the darkness for decades began to power up. These weren't defensive installations, or mining platforms, or research stations. They were shipyards, and they had been building. As the hegemony fleet regrouped in the outer system, preparing for what they assumed would be a prolonged siege of the human homeworld, they received sensor readings that their tactical computers initially rejected as impossible. Thousands of human ships were emerging from concealment throughout the solar system. Not the hastily converted civilian vessels or retrofitted mining craft they had been fighting, but purpose-built warships designed for one specific mission, carrying the war beyond Earth's solar system and into the heart of hegemony space. The prey had become the hunters, and the hunt was about to begin. 6 months after humanity had first appeared on hegemony sensors as a minor species suitable for harvesting, the galaxy was learning a new definition of terror. It wore a human face. Supreme Commander Zex Thull of the Hegemony Grand Fleet stood in the command center of the orbital fortress Eternal Dominion, watching his empire burn. The tactical displays showed red icons across 17 star systems, human fleets emerging from hyperspace, attacking with a coordination and brutality that defied everything the Hegemony thought they knew about warfare. The humans had done something unprecedented in galactic history. They had reverse-engineered Hegemony, faster-than-light technology in less than 4 months, improved upon it, and then used it to launch simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors. But it wasn't just the speed of their technological advancement that was reshaping the balance of power in the galaxy. It was what they were doing to the worlds they conquered.
Supreme Commander, his intelligence chief reported, her voice hollow with disbelief. We've received confirmation from the Kythera system. The human fleet didn't just attack our occupation forces. They liberated the surviving population. Zex Thull's 4 eyes focused on the report with growing confusion. Liberation wasn't a concept that existed in Hegemony military doctrine. When the Hegemony conquered a world, the native population became property. When other species had occasionally mounted successful counterattacks, they typically focused on reclaiming their own territory. But the humans were doing something different. They were freeing everyone. Captain Maria Rodriguez of the human dreadnought Retribution stood on the bridge of her vessel as it emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Mirrorland's homeworld. Her ship was one of 50 that comprised the Liberation Fleet's 3rd Squadron, each vessel purpose-built for a single mission: the complete eradication of Hegemony presence in occupied systems. Captain, her tactical officer reported, we're reading heavy Hegemony presence in orbit around the planet. 12 dreadnoughts, 47 cruisers, and what looks like an entire enforcement division on the surface. Rodriguez studied the displays with the cold calculation that had become humanity's signature approach to warfare. The Hegemony had superior numbers and firepower, but they had made the same mistake that every enemy force had made over the past 6 months. They had underestimated what humans were capable of when they stopped caring about their own survival. All ships, Rodriguez broadcast to her fleet, begin Liberation Protocol 7. Remember why we're here. The human ships moved with a precision that had been honed through months of constant warfare. They didn't engage the Hegemony fleet directly. Instead, they targeted the orbital infrastructure that supported the occupation. FAR, communication relays, supply depots, and most critically, the broadcast stations that transmitted the suffering of enslaved populations for Hegemony entertainment.
But this wasn't just a military operation.
It was something far more sophisticated and psychologically devastating. As the human fleet destroyed Hegemony orbital assets, they simultaneously broadcast to the planet below. Not propaganda or demands for surrender, but something the enslaved Mirrorlands hadn't heard in over a century. Their own history, their own culture, their own language spoken with respect and reverence. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the xenolinguist who had spent the past months learning every enslaved species' language and cultural traditions, had prepared these broadcasts personally. Her voice carried across the Mirrorland's homeworld in their native tongue, reminding them of who they had been before the Hegemony had tried to erase their identity. People of Mirrorland Prime, she said, her words carrying across the planet's communication networks. You are not slaves. You are not property. You are the descendants of the Star Builders, the children of the Light Weavers, the inheritors of wisdom that spans millennia. And today, you are free. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the planet's surface, Hegemony occupation forces found themselves facing something they had never encountered: a planetary uprising coordinated with external military support. The enslaved population didn't just rebel, they fought with the desperation of people who suddenly remembered what they were fighting for. But the Mirrorlands weren't fighting alone. As the Liberation Fleet engaged Hegemony orbital forces, transport ships filled with human volunteers were landing on the planet's surface. These weren't soldiers or weapon specialists, but teachers, doctors, engineers, and historians. They had come not to conquer, but to help rebuild what the Hegemony had destroyed. The message this sent across the galaxy was more powerful than any weapon humanity had yet deployed. For the first time in 3,000 years, a spacefaring species was using their military might not to expand their own territory, but to restore freedom to others. Supreme Commander Zex Thull watched the reports from Mirrorland Prime with a growing sense of dread. The humans hadn't just defeated his forces, they had made them irrelevant. When entire planets began uprising simultaneously, when the enslaved populations remembered their own strength, when liberation forces arrived not as conquerors but as allies, the entire foundation of Hegemony power began to crumble. But the worst was yet to come. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the strategic planning center of the human flagship Vengeance, studying intelligence reports from across hegemony space. The data painted a picture of an empire in complete collapse, but not from military defeats alone. The hegemony was experiencing something far more dangerous, a crisis of identity. "Admiral," Commander Wright reported, "we're receiving surrender requests from 17 different hegemony client species. They want to defect to our alliance." Chen nodded grimly. This was the outcome they had planned for, but experiencing it was still surreal. The hegemony had built their empire on the principle that might made right, that superior technology and willingness to commit atrocities guaranteed dominance. But humans had proven that there were things more powerful than fear. Hope, for instance. And the promise of justice. "What's the status of Operation Reckoning?" Chen asked. Wright consulted his tactical display. "Deep Strike Force Alpha is in position. They're ready to begin the final phase." Operation Reckoning was humanity's ultimate response to 3,000 years of hegemony cruelty. It wasn't just a military campaign. It was a systematic dismantling of everything the hegemony had built. Human fleets were simultaneously attacking every major hegemony stronghold, but they weren't just destroying military assets. They were broadcasting the evidence of hegemony crimes to every world in their empire. Dr. Sarah Kim, whose metallurgical discovery had given humanity their first tactical advantage, had spent the months since then working on something far more ambitious. Using captured hegemony technology, she had developed a way to access their entertainment networks, the very systems they used to broadcast the suffering of enslaved species for amusement. But instead of entertainment programming, the networks were now carrying something else: testimony. Every species the hegemony had conquered, every population they had enslaved, every individual they had tortured for sport, their stories were being told across hegemony space with a reach and clarity that no propaganda could match. The empire that had built itself on the suffering of others was being forced to confront the full scope of their crimes, and the reaction was immediate. On the hegemony capital world of Dominion Prime, riots erupted in the ruling districts. The civilian population, who had spent centuries consuming the suffering of other species as entertainment, found themselves face to face with the reality of what their empire had become. Some were horrified by what they learned. Others were horrified that their entertainment was being interrupted. But a growing number were beginning to ask questions that had never been asked before. Questions about what their civilization had become and whether it deserved to survive. Captain Elena Vasquez, whose destroyer had been one of the first to engage hegemony forces over Earth, now commanded a battle group tasked with the liberation of the Zalari home system. As her ships emerged from hyperspace, she was struck by the devastation the hegemony had wrought on the warrior culture that had dared to resist them. The Zalari homeworld was a graveyard. Cities had been reduced to rubble, forests had been burned to ash, and the proud crystal spires that had once reached toward the stars lay shattered across the landscape. But as her ships began broadcasting liberation protocols, something extraordinary happened. The Zalari weren't extinct. Hidden in deep underground shelters, scattered across the ruins of their civilization, small groups of survivors had endured 3 centuries of hegemony occupation. They had preserved their culture, their traditions, and most importantly, their rage. Human ships came a transmission in heavily accented standard. "This is war leader Kephalar of the Zalari resistance. We have waited 300 years for this day. How can we help you destroy our enemies?" Vasquez smiled grimly. The hegemony had made another critical error. They had assumed that broken civilizations stayed broken, that conquered peoples eventually accepted their fate. They had never considered the possibility that some species would nurse their hatred for centuries, waiting for the chance to strike back. The liberation of Zalari space became something unprecedented in galactic history. Human forces and Zalari resistance fighters worked together to systematically hunt down every hegemony presence in the system. But it wasn't just military cooperation. It was cultural exchange. Human engineers worked alongside Zalari craftsmen to rebuild their cities. Human doctors learned Zalari healing techniques while teaching advanced medical procedures in return. Most importantly, human historians documented everything the Zalari remembered about hegemony crimes, adding their testimony to the growing archive of evidence that was being broadcast across the galaxy. The pattern repeated across dozens of star systems. Each world the humans liberated became not just a military victory, but a center of cultural renaissance. Species that had been forced to abandon their languages relearned them with human help. Civilizations that had seen their art and literature destroyed began creating again with human encouragement. Technologies that had been suppressed by hegemony control were redeveloped through human collaboration. But the most significant transformation was happening to humanity itself. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, whose psychological analysis of hegemony behavior had provided crucial intelligence early in the war, made a discovery that would reshape human understanding of their own species. Working with liberated populations across multiple systems, she identified a pattern in human behavior that had never been documented before. "We're not just fighting a war," she explained to the Emergency Xenopsychology Council. "We're undergoing a species-wide evolution. The stress of prolonged conflict combined with exposure to multiple alien cultures is triggering genetic and psychological changes that are happening in real time." The evidence was overwhelming. Human soldiers who had spent months fighting alongside alien resistance movements were developing enhanced pattern recognition, improved spatial reasoning, and most remarkably, a form of empathic resonance that allowed them to understand and communicate with alien species more effectively than any translation technology. Human scientists working on liberated worlds were making breakthrough discoveries at an unprecedented rate, often by combining human methodology with alien knowledge systems that should have been incompatible. Human artists and writers were creating works that incorporated alien aesthetic principles in ways that created entirely new forms of expression. Humanity was becoming something more than what they had been, and they were doing it faster than any species in galactic history had ever evolved. But evolution was a two-way process. Supreme Commander Zextal stood in the ruins of his command center aboard the Eternal Dominion, reading reports that described the complete collapse of hegemony authority across 17 sectors. His empire, which had stood unchallenged for 3 millennia, was disintegrating in a matter of months. But it wasn't military defeat that was destroying the hegemony. It was something far more insidious and irreversible. It was doubt. For the first time in their civilization's history, hegemony citizens were questioning whether their empire deserved to exist. The constant broadcast of testimony from enslaved species, combined with the obvious superiority of human liberation methods, had created a crisis of conscience that no amount of propaganda could resolve. "Supreme Commander," his aide reported, "we're receiving defection notices from our client species across the Outer Rim. They're requesting protection from the Human Alliance." Zextal nodded with bitter resignation. The hegemony had built their power on fear, but humans had given the galaxy something more powerful than fear. They had given it hope for justice. "Sir," another officer reported, "we're also receiving surrender requests from our own military commanders. Admiral Kethvar of the 4th Fleet, General Vexhai of the Occupation Forces, Commander Thelnar of the Intelligence Division. They're all requesting to negotiate terms." The Supreme Commander studied the tactical display showing the approaching human fleets. They would be here within hours, and when they arrived, they would face no meaningful resistance. The hegemony military had lost the will to fight, not because they couldn't win individual battles, but because they could no longer justify why they should. "Open a channel to the human flagship," Zextal ordered. The communication screen flickered to life, showing Admiral Sarah Chen standing on the bridge of the Vengeance. Behind her, displays showed the liberated worlds that now flew alongside human ships in a growing alliance of free species. "Supreme Commander," Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just reshaped the balance of power in the galaxy. "I assume you're ready to discuss terms." "I am," Zextal replied. "But I must ask, what do you want? Territory? Resources? Tribute? What is the price of peace with humanity?" Chen's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made Zextal understand that he had asked the wrong question. "We don't want your territory, Supreme Commander. We don't want your resources. We don't want tribute or submission or any of the things your empire was built on." She paused, and when she continued, her words carried the weight of an entire species' determination. "We want justice. For every species you've enslaved, every world you've destroyed, every individual you've murdered for entertainment. We want an accounting of 3,000 years of crimes, and we want assurance that nothing like the hegemony will ever exist again." Zextal felt something he had never experienced before: shame. Not for military defeat or political failure, but for what his civilization had become. "And if we agree to this accounting," he asked, "what happens to my people?" "That depends," Chen replied, "on whether they choose to be part of the solution or remain part of the problem." As the human fleets took position around the hegemony capital, the galaxy watched the end of an era. The civilization that had dominated through cruelty was surrendering to one that had chosen to fight for the freedom of others. But this wasn't just the end of the hegemony. It was the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history, an alliance of species united not by conquest or domination, but by the shared commitment to ensuring that no civilization would ever again build its power on the suffering of others. The galaxy had trembled under hegemony cruelty for 3 millennia. Now it would learn what it meant to be protected by humanity's justice. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whose linguistic work had helped liberate enslaved populations across the galaxy, stood in the newly constructed Galactic Memorial on Earth. The structure was built from materials contributed by every species in the growing alliance, and its walls were inscribed with the names of every individual known to have suffered under hegemony rule. But the memorial wasn't just a monument to the past, it was a promise for the future. "We remember," she read from the inscription at the memorial's heart, "not to nurture hatred, but to ensure that such suffering is never again ignored, never again tolerated, and never again allowed to masquerade as strength." Around the galaxy, similar memorials were being constructed on liberated worlds. Each one carried the same message, translated into hundreds of languages and communication methods the galaxy would remember. And it would never again mistake cruelty for power. As the last hegemony forces formally surrendered and their leadership faced tribunals that would determine the fate of their civilization, humanity found itself in a position they had never sought. They were the dominant military force in the galaxy. But dominance wasn't the goal, and it never had been. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the Vengeance, watching ships from dozens of species working together to establish the infrastructure for a new galactic government. It wouldn't be ruled by humanity, or by any single species. It would be governed by representatives from every member world, with one simple mandate: to protect the weak from the strong, and to ensure that power was never again used to cause suffering for entertainment. Admiral Commander Wright reported, "We're receiving the final tally from the liberation campaigns. 47 star systems freed, 86 species liberated, and over 12 billion individuals removed from hegemony control." Chen nodded, but her expression remained somber. And the cost? 700,000 human casualties across all campaigns. Another 2 million wounded. The final count is still being compiled. The price had been heavy, but every human who had fought in the liberation campaigns had done so as a volunteer. They had understood what they were fighting for, not conquest or glory, but the simple principle that no one should suffer for another's amusement. "Ma'am," Wright continued, "there's something else. We're receiving applications from thousands of young people across the Alliance. They want to join Earth Defense Forces, not as soldiers, but as liberation specialists. They want to ensure that if another hegemony ever rises, the galaxy will be ready." Chen smiled for the first time in months. Humanity had set out to protect their own world from alien invaders. In the process, they had created something far more valuable. They had shown the galaxy that there was an alternative to the cycle of conquest and submission that had defined interstellar politics for millennia. They had proven that sometimes the strongest response to cruelty wasn't greater cruelty, but justice. As the Vengeance set course for Earth, carrying news of the war's end, Admiral Chen reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. Humanity had gone from an unknown species on a primitive world to the guardians of galactic freedom. But perhaps more importantly, the galaxy itself had changed. For the first time in recorded history, it was governed not by fear, but by hope. The hegemony had trembled under their own cruelty for 3,000 years. Now the galaxy would flourish under humanity's protection, and the universe would be a better place because humans had refused to accept that cruelty was simply the way things had to be. They had crossed humanity's final line, and in doing so, they had awakened something that would reshape the stars themselves. Justice, with a human face, was coming to the galaxy, and it would never be the same.